Hey everybody, I'm Tim Mooney. The Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater is a touring company that brings one-man shows to schools, conferences, festivals across the US and Canada. If you're a student of history or oratory, or if you just want to understand these a little better or get better at speaking yourself, you'll want to stick around to hear how you can finally get the great speeches. I'll be performing this show on this Sunday and Monday, June 14th and 15th, 2020, on Facebook and Zoom, respectively, and then again in mid-August and mid-October. Next week, I'm back with another show, Lot O' Shakespeare. And every week I'm doing these brief explainer videos. My goal here is to double your ability to access, understand, and enjoy these plays. You'll want to hit like or subscribe to make sure you don't miss anything. I'll put these videos up every Friday in advance of these Sunday and Monday performances. I vaguely remember being aware of Friends, Romans, Countrymen and Lincoln's 77 years ago, way back during grade school, as being examples of great speeches, although I never understood them back then. Even now, I sometimes begin reciting one rather than the other because they're so closely linked in my mind, and they both start with the letter F. Fourscore, Friends, Romans. Of course, I now realize that they have almost nothing to do with each other, except for the way that they both masterfully manipulate rhetoric. While I do want to get into questions of rhetoric in a future episode of this, I thought it best to start out with just what made these speeches appeal to me, so that perhaps you might come to share the fondness that I've discovered for them and be eager for more. This video will cover the first 5 speeches of the show, The Greatest Speech of All Time, and we'll be back again with a video covering the second half of the play in advance of our next performance in August. Here we go. I remember very little from my freshman college philosophy class, but I remember Socrates being particularly fun, how he would repeatedly insist that he knows nothing and proceed to demonstrate that the other person in any given argument also knows nothing. But given that Socrates already knows that he knows nothing, he has at least a leg up on them and their lack of knowledge about their own ignorance. What I love about this speech, the apology, is that as with many great speeches, life and death are hanging in the balance, and Socrates chooses death over compromising his principles, famously insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living. He is given repeated opportunities to apologize or acknowledge some sort of wrongness, as well as opportunities to escape his captivity in advance of his execution. It's almost as though he is goading those who are condemning him to death to actually follow through on their sentence, if only because he knows that that decision will haunt them for the rest of their lives. In fact, he says, prophetically, "For I say, there will be more accusers of you than there are now, and as they are younger than I, they will be more severe with you, and you will be more offended at them. For if you think that by killing men you can avoid the accuser censoring your behavior, you are mistaken. That is not a means of escape. The easiest and noblest way is not to be crushing others, but to be improving yourselves." And that last is my favorite line of the speech. My favorite lines are generally bits that remind me of how we still have that same problem even now, thousands of years later. How often do we or our world leaders seek first to crush others than to fix our own character flaws? I will have lots to say about Mark Antony's Friends, Romans, Countrymen in other videos. It shows up there in 3 of my shows. Of course, including this speech in this play is a bit of cheating, because it's a speech drawn already from a play, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And yet Shakespeare based it on an actual historical speech that Mark Antony actually gave. Antony, insisting that he is not a great speaker, climbs the mountain that this speech is with simple, mostly single-syllable words. The only 4-syllable words are his repeated use of honorable and single use of ingratitude. Brutus has just delivered an eloquent speech that is just a little too clever, with a certain self-congratulatory smugness. The only actual reason that Brutus can offer to justify Caesar's assassination is that Caesar's ambition had threatened all of their freedom. Brutus seems to have won over the crowd, and amid the height of his clear victory, he leaves the forum for Mark Antony to string together whatever pitiful words he might express in memory of Julius Caesar. Antony has agreed to speak nothing but words of honor and respect for Brutus and the conspirators. But in the process of doing so, in spite of the fact that he repeats again and again that Brutus is an honorable man, he almost accidentally seems to reveal that Caesar, in his greatness and generosity, was assassinated out of spite and envy. These repeated ironies build up to a feverish pitch, and in one of my favorite lines, Antony reveals the simplicity of his argument. "I tell you that which you yourselves do know." A knowledge that would encourage not only them, but, as he says, finally expressing the extent of his outrage over the assassination, "the stones of Rome to rise and mutiny." Some of the greatest speeches simply remind you, the listener, of those things you already know. There is very little that is funny about Fredrick Douglass' 4th of July speech, The Hypocrisy of American Slavery, and I usually look for funny. We mostly know it as the 4th of July speech, though it was delivered on the 5th of July. Maybe it was a 3-day weekend. Much of the point of this speech is that, unlike Mark Antony, he can't bring himself to be ironic. He can't dance around the truth. He can't hide his direct meaning. In one of my favorite lines, "Where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued." Just like Mark Antony, he's saying, I'm just telling you what you know already. Fredrick Douglass has a very important, very logical argument to make. The Declaration of Independence declares that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, we celebrate the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, and Fredrick Douglass has been invited to speak in honor of that celebration. But as far as slaves are concerned, any such celebration is a fraud. And Fredrick Douglass calls it out again and again. There is very little artistry in the speech, other than a plain argument spoken eloquently. The slaveholders' only argument against freeing the slaves has to hinge on the word men in "all men are created equal." They have to portray the slaves as somehow being less than men in order to deny them the treatment that the Declaration promises. Douglass argues, the slaveholders themselves recognize it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. In that very act, they acknowledge the slave to be a moral, intellectual, responsible being. In other words, a man, going so far as to forbid the teaching of the slave to read or write. When you can point me to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. It's a powerful, unrelenting, forceful speech. It's a speech that even now people sometimes struggle to hear. 7 years ago is probably the most familiar speech in American history, if not all of history, and I developed a rather radical opinion of it when I settled in to actually memorize it. Lincoln, knowing the gravity of the speech and knowing the obligatory display of honor and reverence that was to be expected of him, dedicating the fields of Gettysburg to the thousands who had died there, repeatedly and purposefully rides right up to the edge of doing just the opposite. In the speech's most famous moment, he says, "But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground." I have to imagine that Lincoln took a big, fat pause there to let the crowd struggle through this paradox, because I can't help but think that in that moment most minds jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Lincoln is disrespecting war heroes. Somehow he's suggesting they don't deserve the great honor being bestowed in their memory, which is borderline sacrilege. Of course, Lincoln reverses these assumptions and doubles down on the sacred mission. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. He pulls off one of the greatest rhetorical reversals ever, turning his seeming sacrilege into an ever greater tribute to their heroism. He does it again. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Awkward pause. But it can never forget what they did here. Lincoln teases, threatening at least 4 times to violate the sanctity of the moment, and then turns each threat into an even greater celebration of these dead heroes. And I believe that it is that dance between the sacred and the disrespectful that creates a tension underlying this speech that lifted this speech above all the others. One of the most effective elements of a great speech: reversal. I looked long and hard for a female speech that would inspire me in a similar way. Many of the ones I found were just a little too apologetic, coming out of the context of the patriarchy, and they sometimes suggest, hey, I'm sorry to be speaking up, but here are some of the domestic concerns that I, as a woman, might know something about. Emma Goldman had none of that. She does speak about issues of which women have serious concerns, but she absolutely does not shy away from taking on the patriarchy, the government, and especially the military. Beginning with a soft focus on the concept of patriotism, she then leads us into an understanding of how that vague patriotic sentiment corrupts us. She sets us up with tranquil recollections of childhood and the spirit of patriotism, which encourages us to imagine ourselves as nobler, better, grander, more intelligent than those living beings inhabiting any other spot. An understanding which leads us to teach our children that their duty is to fight, kill, and die in the attempt to impose our superiority upon all the others. She takes that beautiful pastoral recollection of childhood and twists it, reminding us of just how crudely it has been corrupted by the fear of the other, leading us to project dynamite bombs from flying machines upon helpless citizens. Again, a reversal of your expectations. Again, a stark reminder of who we are today, over 100 years later, caught up in wars that we fight remotely. So that's my take on the great speeches, at least those dating back to 400 BC up to 1908. There's more there to get, but if you keep these things in mind, you've already doubled your likelihood of totally getting this play. Next time around, we'll look at more speeches from the 20th century: Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Dwight Eisenhower, and Martin Luther King. Please come join me for this week's performance of The Greatest Speech of All Time, Sunday night, June 14th on Facebook, Monday night, June 15th on Zoom, or again in August and October 2020. All shows are at 9 o'clock Central Time. Tickets for Monday night shows are $5 and available at calendly.com/Tim Mooney Rep. The show is also available to come to your school, theater group, or festival or conference, or I can perform for you online. If you've gotten anything out of this video, please give it a like or subscribe to this channel. There's a lot more I'll be covering. You'll want to click here for more of these explainer videos, or perhaps here for a taste of these great speeches. Again, we're the Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater. Our goal is to inspire, inform, enlighten, educate, and entertain. If you're interested in supporting that mission, any donations are deductible to the fullest extent of allowable by law. You can support us and find lots more goodies with books and links and videos and a Patreon campaign through timmooneyRep.com. See you on the stage.